Dr. Bailey Norwood is a researcher who focuses on consumer preference and consumer behavior. He's done some recent impactful work on approaches to administering food security assessments, which he will be sharing with us today. Welcome, Dr. Norwood.
Hello, thank you. I'm not able to, I think you need to let me start the video. Yeah.
I think you should be able to share your screen.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm in quarantine right now. And if my dogs even suspect that someone's walking in the road in front of the house, chaos is going to erupt and I'll have to yell at them to be quiet. So just know that that may happen. Well, so what I'm going to present today is about how to use, whether we can use and how to use cheap internet surveys for measuring U.S. food insecurity. And I do some research in food insecurity, but this is really the only thing I do. The only thing I have really researched is how we can use cheap internet surveys to measure food insecurity. And so, I'm assuming if you wanted to measure the food insecurity for students on the campus, and you wanted to use it doing internet surveys, then this might be applicable for you. And when I say that, the main question for me about whether you can use inexpensive internet surveys is whether you can get numbers that are similar to what the USDA gets. And you can tell I have a bird in the background. I have a cover over it, and hopefully that'll keep them quiet most of the time. So let me just start with this. So, if you're going to measure food security, the gold standard is the numbers that are used by the USDA. And, I think y'all have already covered this, but let me just emphasize that since it's administered as part of the current population survey every December, and because they spend a lot, a little over $500,000 on it, it's a really good survey. And the reason it's so good is because it's as representative as a survey can be. They've just spared absolutely no expense to not only be as representative of the population as possible, but to implement the survey in a way where you're going to get a high response rate and people are going to answer the questions thoughtfully. So we start with that. USDA, the way they get their food security numbers is the best. You can't beat it. But the problem is it's cumbersome, it's expensive. And so when COVID-19 came up, you can't just do the normal food security survey as part of current population survey. You just can't do it spontaneously. And even if you could, you couldn't do it cheap. And so one thing I wanted to, during these times, we might want to say, well, can we just use cheap internet surveys instead? And so that's what my research has involved. And I'm going to argue that you can use them. They're okay. They provide decent estimates. Not great, but I think they're good enough that you can use. They're cheap. The surveys I do only run about $5,000. If you don't count my time in it, can be administered easily whenever you want. You can get results back in like 2 days. And when I did the survey in May of this year, I surprisingly found that food insecurity didn't increase much, if at all. And, that may sound surprising. I don't know if I believe that, but that's what the numbers say. And I'll give you a reason why it's like that towards the end of the presentation. And what I'm presenting to you today, these are based off of 2 articles I published with some other people in a journal called Applied Economic Perspectives and Policy. It's one of the most applied journals in the field of agriculture economics. Okay, so Let me just start by this. I know a lot of people here know how these food security surveys are done, and I know you've been talking about it all morning, but I just need to highlight a few things about it because it's going to be very important to how we do internet surveys. So first, let me just briefly point out some things about how food security is measured by the USDA. Well, as a lot of you know, they ask these questions, and you get 10 to 18 questions depending on whether your household has children or not. And I've just got two of these questions here. So, one question was, I was worried whether my food would run out before I got money to buy more. Was that often, sometimes, or never true for you in the last 12 months? And they have 4 different answers that they can give there. And I've got 2 in bold, often true or sometimes true. That's what the USDA/ERS, Economic Research Service, people refer to as an affirmative answer, meaning they're affirming that they have food insecurity. And you give them the 10 to 18 questions, and they're deemed food insecure if they give a certain number of affirmative answers. And, scientists, researchers had to determine how many affirmative answers you have to give before you're deemed food insecure. And so these are partly a subjective construct, and that we have to decide at what point that we deem people to be food insecure. And just to give you an example, in 2016, that's going to be an important year because that's where a lot of my research took place. They deemed about 12.3 of US households to be food insecure. Now, the next thing is the most important thing as far as my research. We say that households are given 10 to 18 questions, but that's not exactly true. Some households are not actually given the questions. They're just assumed to be food secure. So notice I have this preliminary question up here, and it says, which of these statements best describe the foods eaten in your household in the last 12 months? And we've got bold answers there. So if they say enough, but not always the kind of foods I want to eat, or sometimes not enough to eat, that is a affirmative answer. It's indicative of food insecurity. But what the USDA does, or what the current population survey does, they're first going to ask this preliminary question. And if a household answers enough of the kinds of foods that they want to eat on that preliminary question, and if their income is above 185% of the poverty threshold, then the enumerator, meaning the person administering the survey, they're going to stop there. They're going to mark the household as food secure, and they're not going to ask them the rest of the questions. And that's going to be very important. And they do that, and they know from research that if you did go ahead, if you took some of those households that were screened out, not given the questions, assumed food secure, but if you went ahead and asked them the food security questionnaire, some of them would actually be deemed food insecure. So we know that through the screening process, we are assuming some people are food secure when in reality, they're not. And they have good reasons for doing it. I think they should do it, but that's going to be important for when you implement an internet survey. So that right there covers how the USDA measures food security using their really good but expensive surveys. Now I'm going to describe how I measure food insecurity for the US population using my cheap internet surveys. And so what I do is I administer an internet survey, and I ask the exact same questions. So it's exactly like the USDA questionnaire. But one difference is I'm going to ask people all 10 to 18 food security questions, regardless of their answer to that preliminary question and regardless of their income. So what that means is I'm not screening anybody out. Everybody answers the questions. I don't just assume some people are food secure based on a screening process. And so what that means is that the kinds of people, the population of people who are answering my questions, the 10 to 18 questions, are actually different than the people who are answering the USDA questions. And so you have this really important question. USDA screens them, I don't. Should I be mimicking the USDA screening process? And do I need to do that to get numbers that are close to the USDA numbers? And know that everything else I do in the survey is exactly as the USDA does it. And so I'm going to say, yes, we do need the screen, because look at this. When I did my first internet survey measuring food insecurity in 2016, note that the USDA said 12% of households are food insecure in 2016. But in my survey, when I don't screen anybody, I measure 43% of households are food insecure. And that seems crazy, right? I mean, I'm doing this internet survey and I'm concluding that basically half of America is food insecure. That's really high. I don't think it reflects reality. I don't think half of Americans are food insecure. And so next we say, what if I actually mimic the USDA screening process? Meaning, if they answer to the preliminary questions enough of the kinds of food I want to eat, and if their income is more than 185% of the poverty threshold, what if I just mark them as being food secure, regardless of how they actually answer the questions? And when I do that, I then get a food insecurity rate of 33%. So when I do mimic the USDA screening procedure, I do get numbers that are closer to the USDA numbers, the gold standard of 12%, but it's still way off. And if we just stop there, I personally would conclude that internet surveys are not good for measuring food insecurity because they're just so different from the USDA. But we're not going to stop there. We have some other things we can do. Note that 43% me without screening, that's just the raw survey responses. And so there's two other things I can do. Note that, another big difference between the USDA survey and my cheap internet survey is how representative the sample is. If you take the USDA survey and you ask, is it representative? Meaning, is the demographic profile of the sample similar to that of the nation? Absolutely, yes. The USDA, you just cannot get more representative than what they do unless you actually administer the survey to every single person like in a census. And then you say, my survey, is it representative? Absolutely not. It's not even close. My survey sample is representative of the nation in terms of a few things like gender and ethnicity. So if you look at the percent of females in my internet sample, it's almost identical to the US population. If you look at the percent of African Americans or the percent of Hispanic, it's going to be very, very similar to the US population. But the sample still differs in a lot of other ways. And one example is the percent of households with an unemployed member. For instance, in 2016, in my sample, like 25% of every household who answered my internet survey had an unemployed member in the household, meaning someone who was unemployed but looking for work. Whereas for the nation as a whole, that number's 8%, was 8% in 2016. Note, that's not the unemployment rate, it's the percent of households who have an unemployed member. So my sample has a much higher prevalence of unemployment than the population. And so it's different, but we know that there are some tools we can use to correct for that, a thing called sample balancing. where you weight each respondent, you give each respondent a weight, and when you take weighted averages, it makes the sample look like the population. And so, like during the presidential election, when we had lots of polls, every number you saw there, like if it was 45% voting for, let's say, Trump, that wasn't actually 45% of the sample. That was a weighted percentage. Every poll is going to use sample balancing to make the sample behave and mimic the population to correct for those unrepresented properties. And so what if I use sample balancing in my survey? And in particular, what I do is I especially correct for things like unemployment, use of food stamps, things like that. And when I use sample balancing for that, so let's look what happens. Again, in 2016, the USDA said 12% households food insecure. In my survey, without sample balancing, and this is also without screening, so we're taking out the screening again. Without sample balancing, just the raw numbers, I say 43% of the American public is food insecure. But then when I use sample balancing, that number goes down to 30%. So yes, my numbers in a cheap internet survey are way off compared to USDA. Sample balancing does make them come closer to the USDA, but they're still way off. We're still saying like a third of all Americans are food insecure, and that's just not consistent with what the USDA measures. And so next you may ask, okay, first I tried using the USDA screening technique, and then I tried sample balancing. What if I include both of them? I use both screening and sample balancing. Well, when I do that, we're getting better. So again, 2016, the USDA said 12% Americans are food insecure. In my raw survey, without screening or sample balancing, I find 43%. But then when I both include screening and sample balancing, that number comes down to 26%. So I'm getting closer to the USDA numbers. But in my opinion, that is still way too high compared to USDA. If we stop there, I would say food insecurity cannot be measured using cheap internet surveys. And so what I did then is I did one other thing. I said, is there some kind of like calibration tool I can use to make my numbers come much, much closer to USDA numbers? And one thing we did is we said, what if we use a more stringent screening procedure? What if we just assume everybody in our sample who has a household income greater than 185% is food secure? So again, USDA had their screening procedure where you had to clear 2 hurdles to be assumed food secure. I'm only requiring them to go through 1 hurdle. So if their income's above 185% of the poverty threshold, I'm just going to assume they're food secure. And when I do that, now we're getting to some closer numbers. So first look at 2016, USDA said 12%. In my internet survey with no adjustments at all, I find 43%. But then when I use this more stringent screening procedure and when I use sample balancing, I get 16%. And that's pretty close to the USDA. That's a pretty good number. It's close enough to the USDA that I would say internet surveys can be used to measure food insecurity. But that was just for 2016. Maybe I just got lucky using that more stringent screening procedure. So in 2017, I repeated the survey, did the exact same thing, and then using the more stringent screening procedure, I got 13%, which is really close to the USDA's 12%. So I did replicate that to show that the calibration procedure does seem to work in at least 2 years. Granted, it's only 2 observations, but I don't have money to do them every month. And so if we stop there, we say, can we use internet surveys to measure food insecurity? My conclusion thus far is that I say, yes, I think we can, but you have to use a more stringent screening procedure. and you have to make sure you use sample balancing. And when you do that, you can get numbers that are actually pretty close to the USDA numbers. So given that I had some evidence that internet surveys were useful, I then wanted to say, well, let's use this survey during COVID and actually measure food insecurity, you know, check in on the nation and see how COVID is impacting their food security. And so what I did is I did the survey exactly like I showed you right there. I, used the exact same questions, exact same methods. I used sample balancing and the screening procedure. And this is what I found. And I've got some more numbers to kind of help you put things into context. In 2008, the USDA found the food insecurity rate in the US was 14.6%. And I'm showing 2008 there because that was, during the Great Recession. That was when we had bad economic times, and food insecurity should have been much higher. And then just a reminder that the USDA in 2018 found that the food insecurity rate was 11.1%. So we know that in really bad times, the USDA finds food insecurity to be about 15%. In good times, normal times, they find it to be 11, 12%. So what did I find in, and one more thing, note that using my cheap internet survey from 2016 to 2017, I would get a food insecurity rate between 13 and 16%. So what did I find in May of 2020? And I think this was done I think it was May 13th and 14th. What I found, I estimated a food insecurity rate of 15.4%. And I used some simulations to get a standard error of that. That's actually that 1.61% plus minus. That's like a 95% confidence interval. It's basically two standard deviations above and below 15.4%. So what that means is in May 2020, if I repeated the survey over and over, sometimes I would get insecurity rate of 14%. Sometimes I would get a food insecurity rate of 17%. So it would be between 14 and 17%. And notice that's quite similar to what my cheap internet survey found in 2016 and 2017. So I didn't really find an increase in food insecurity during COVID compared to 2016 and 2017. That's what the numbers say. When I use this, when I use my surveys, the best way I know how to measure food insecurity, I can't really say that food insecurity rose. Now, do I personally believe that food insecurity rose? Absolutely. And that's one reason I didn't do a press release of these findings. I was scared people would think I was insensitive if I released these findings, because I, in fact, did think that food insecurity rose. Just got one more slide here, and hoping everybody's able to follow this pretty well. But one thing you can use it for, you can say another way of saying how COVID-19 has impacted food insecurity, you can separate food insecurity rates for different types of people. So I've got a graph here, the bar on the far left. These are from my sample that was administered in May of 2020 during COVID. The first bar refers to household members who lost a job during a pandemic, and it was a lot of them. And their food insecurity rate was really high, like 25%. The next bar is a household making less money during the pandemic. And I found the food insecurity rate to be about 10%. Now, a household could be in both those bars. A household who had a member lost a job is also going to be a household who's usually making money. They could be in both of those. And then finally, in the far right, households whose financial status has not changed, that food insecurity rate is just like 7%. And so, that's what I found. I'm hoping that was clear. I tried to just focus on a few things so that everybody could follow it and see what the important things were about internet surveys. But I'll gladly take any questions if anything was unclear, if you have any other.
Thank you. That was fascinating findings. While we're waiting for questions to come in, you feel free to type in the Q&A or raise your hand and I'll unmute you. I did have a question about sample size, and I'm sorry if I missed this. Broadly, what were your samples across each of your measurement periods?
Oh yeah, about 1,100, between 1,100 and 1,500 people.
The other question that I had was related to your COVID findings. Do you think perhaps that the timing of May, you didn't see much of an effect is because people weren't unemployed yet and stimulus checks were on their way? And, do you think that there are other things that were impacting that? And if you were to do the survey later, that you'd find differences?
I think the thing that may have impacted it and given me those high numbers is if you actually look at those questions, they're written and they refer to the past 12 months. So the questions are going to specifically refer to the past 12 months. Now, I do a lot of work with surveys, and I don't think people will actually read the questions that carefully and they would answer it like that. I think if a household really did have a lot of food insecurity problems, they wouldn't say, let me think about the last 12 months. They'd say, what's going on now? And of course, the questions say, has it happened anytime in the last 12 months? I'm just throwing out the idea that maybe 12 months had something to do with it. I don't actually think so, but that is one idea. If I remember, I wanted to say the stimulus checks came in before May, but I may be wrong.
I couldn't quite remember, so me neither.
I think they did. And another thing is that I noticed, I do some work with the food bank here, and as soon as COVID happened, man, they really ramped up their scheduling and how they operate, and they had plenty of food for anybody who actually needed food. So as long as you're willing to use the food bank, they really came out and responded to COVID to try to help people. So it might be like you were saying that there was enough help from a lot of different places that people actually did not experience food insecurity. But I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine on that.
There's a question from Allison. She says, thanks for your work. Early monitoring of food insecurity has been really important. You mentioned sample balancing to make your sample more representative of the US population and getting closer to the US food insecurity rate. Do you think associations you find between job loss and depressed wages and food insecurity are also reflective of the general population or specific to your survey sample?
Read that last sentence again.
Do you think the associations you found between job loss and depressed wages and food insecurity are also reflective of the general population or specific to your survey sample?
I would think so, but I haven't actually done any analysis to see if I understand that question correctly. But if you look at the relationship between unemployment and food insecurity in the sample, it's going to have a very similar relationship to the USDA, I think. And so what someone might be able to do is take the statistical relationship between unemployment and food insecurity in the USDA surveys, and then use more recent numbers on unemployment to actually get a good estimate of how food insecurity changed during COVID. And that actually is that's how I would do it. That would be my preferred way of actually getting a good number. And I'm pretty sure that I saw a report that Feeding America had where they estimated how the food insecurity rate would change. And I'm pretty sure that it was Craig Gunderson who did that analysis. And if it was so, I'm also pretty certain that he just used that statistical relationship between unemployment and food insecurity.
Yeah, that report, they use different levels of unemployment and different levels of poverty to predict potential increases in food insecurity. And I can put that, I'll find it during the next talk and put that in the chat so people can see that. Allison, did Dr. Norwood answer your question? Okay, great, thanks. Brenna, I think you also have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Hey Bailey, it's Brenna, long time, no talk. One question I had for you is, well, it seems like without the screeners and without the balancing, we get really high rates, which is what we've observed in college students. That seems to suggest to me that there's still some interpretational issues going on even in the general population. So I'm just curious, like, do you think it's worth thinking about this, or should we just say, well, if we do all these things, then we can get it close enough to the USDA? Or I mean, like, bigger picture, should we be going back and saying, like, how are people actually thinking about these questions?
I think regardless, regardless of what I found, I think going in and like, I think it was your work that, where you actually ask people about how they think about the questions and stuff. I think that's just always a great idea. And really, and I'm pretty sure the USDA did or the people who put together this food security survey, I think they probably did a lot of that. But yeah, absolutely. I do think that would be a good idea.
Well, looks like there are no more questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Norwood.
Oh, glad to.